Hello, my name is Chris Morris. I'm the Director of Faith Formation here at Holy Family Catholic Church in Orange, California. Also an avid fan of the Shroud of Turin and its story, which I think is just amazing. And I am making this video for the anteaters, the Catholic anteaters at UCI, University of California, Irvine. At the request of Father Ben, he has asked me to come and speak to the group, and as always, I like to pre-record a version of any talk so that those that miss all or part of it can come and check it out, and that those that enjoyed it can share it with others. So we are going to do that today. We're going to break it into two 40-minute sessions approximately. For those of you watching the video, obviously you can just keep going all the way through for the entire 80 minutes or so. And last thing I want to do just before we get started, I also want to give a shout out to Anya and Josh, who may also be watching this. I hope you enjoy it as well. So Shroud of Turin, a lot of debate. If you know nothing about the Shroud of Turin, I will give you some detail about its background. But the big debate is this the burial cloth of Jesus Christ? Or an alternative theory is this is just some amazing hoax from the medieval period. So we're going to kind of walk through a little bit of the history, a lot of the science, and touch theology just a little bit from time to time where it's relevant. But for the purpose of this shorter version of the talk, we're really going to stick to history and science as much as possible. So, where does this story begin? Well, a lot of people tell you it begins in the year 1355 with Marguerite de Charnay. Okay, so if this is the burial cloth of Jesus, you would think the story starts in the first century, but many people believe this story actually starts in 1355 with the amazing announcement by the de Charnay family that they have the burial cloth of Jesus, that they obtained it through as a spoil of war. So they're a little cryptic on how they got it. But they will begin putting it on public display in Liry, France. This would have been north central France, in a church that was built by Marguerite's grandfather, Geoffrey de Charnay, who was quite famous as a Templar knight and often thought to be the Grand Master of the Templars in the Normandy region. They were very secretive about who their Grand Masters were, but there's good reason to believe Geoffrey de Charnay was the Grand Master. And we later find out that he is actually burned at the stake for that for holding that very position. So good reason to believe he was. So a lot of people think out of nowhere in 1355, the de Charnay family announces they have what would essentially be, one of the greatest relics in the history of Christianity in their possession, and that people were welcome to come and make a pilgrimage to this church and view it in person. You have to understand something about this period of time. Late medieval period was a very pious period. Relics were highly venerated. Making pilgrimages had been a huge part of the Christian experience, really for centuries, even before this. So there was a big business in religious artifacts and relics and anything to do with religious history, as it could draw people to make a pilgrimage to the site where these items were stored. And whenever you have a lot of people coming to a place, that means there's money to be spent. So the result of that was you also had a great deal of fraud, okay, a great deal of counterfeit, and just all out crazy relics and artifacts that were created. The favorite story is, the peddler comes to the city saying, I have the head of John the Baptist. And, the people in that city say, well, we already have the head of John the Baptist in our church. And he says, well, I have his head from when he was younger, which is just a ridiculous claim. But, you can't have two heads. But again, that's the kind of environment we're talking about. It was so popular to go on these pilgrimages that people often would buy these little badges that represented the pilgrimage site. So what you're seeing on the left-hand side is a cloth badge, the remnants of one from the Liry pilgrimage site. You can see the shroud in the upper portion and the crests of the de Charnays and his wife on the lower portion. And what would happen is people would buy these badges at the pilgrimage site and they would sew them onto their jacket or shirt and have a whole collection. Steve, think of it like, Boy Scouts getting merit badges or Girl Scouts getting merit badges, or in more, the commercial atmosphere, think about it like Disney fans who collect the little Disney pins and wear them. Disney didn't invent that. This is something that goes way back in human history. People are quite proud of what pilgrimage sites they visited, and this is one way they could show that. So, the question that we have to answer here is, okay, if it truly was the burial cloth of Jesus, where was it for the 1300 years between his death, the resurrection, and ascension, and it popping out of nowhere in Liry, France? And this is the question that most skeptics will just lean into, because the reality is it's a viable question, and it's one that absolutely needs to be answered. So before we attempt to make an answer, I do want to spend a minute, go a little bit, take a step back for those who do not know much about the Shroud, and talk about some things that are undisputed facts about the Shroud itself. Okay. And you're going to see a lot of imagery on the background of these slides. I'm trying to give you some Shroud imagery that may be of use. But these are undisputed facts. So whether it's skeptics or, believers that this is the burial cloth of Jesus, here are 12, and I picked 12 because, we love 12 in anything religion, okay? Especially Christianity, the 12 tribes, the 12 apostles, the 12 days of Christmas, whatever you want to go with here. These are 12 undisputed facts. Okay. So first off, the Shroud is a very large cloth, 8 cubits by 2 cubits, which is a little over 14 feet long and about 3.5 feet wide. It was made of plants from the Palestinian region, flax. Okay, so linen is a natural fiber, in this case made of flax. In first century Palestine, it contained a herringbone weave pattern, which is interesting. Jesus is often referred to using the sign of a fish. Okay, so maybe a little coincidence there. But what's really important about the herringbone weave pattern is this was a very difficult pattern to master in the first century. Hence, only the wealthiest of the wealthy could afford a cloth that had this type of pattern weaved into it. So this was certainly a cloth that at least at one point was owned by a very wealthy person. And it also contains weave faults that are specific to the first century. So weaving equipment, weaving looms have evolved and continue to evolve over time, but all of them have a fault. And you can actually identify different faults in the weave and then use that identified fault to target to when that item was weaved or what age of a loom was used to weave that item. So, in this case, they say, yeah, this was clearly a first century loom because it was a first century loom weave fault. Doesn't mean that it couldn't have been woven in the 19th century using a first century loom, but again, it does go to support that this would be a first century cloth. It contains a mysterious blood-stained image of a well-built man. A well-built man is, that's a phrase that's actually used by a scientific team that analyze this, but I like to repeat it just to, I like to think of Jesus as being a pretty stout fellow. So he would have been tall for his period of life in the first century. 5'10" to 5'11" would have been pretty tall. But this image that appears on this linen cloth is of a man who was beaten and scourged and crucified and speared in the chest and impaled with a crown of thorns. So the image that appears on this cloth is an image of someone who went through the sufferings that Jesus was known to have suffered through the Gospels. Okay, and in a very, very accurate depiction of that suffering in this image. I want to stop for a second and just point out this is an image on a linen cloth. Okay, this is years between before photographic technology was even dreamed of. And a linen cloth is not photosensitive. So this is somehow an image that's been placed on this cloth using a technique that we are unaware of. Matter of fact, we're still unaware of it today. You're later going to find out it wasn't painted, dyed, stained, using any other technique that we're aware of. So this is a very unusual and mysterious image. What makes it even more unusual and mysterious is it contains information that was not well known or not known at all in some cases until the 20th century. So for example, the injuries that appear on this individual's head, which appear to be as if there were small puncture wounds, say from a crown of thorns, It does not appear to be from a crown that is in the traditional sense as it would be depicted in religious artwork, which is as a ringlet that circled the head and was open on top. This appears to be a crown of thorns that would have been more like a skull cap. And interestingly enough, in the 20th century, it was discovered that early crowns of kings from this period of time would have actually been a skull cap. They would not have been a ringlet. So it makes perfect sense. But then again, this was something we did not know until relatively recently in our scientific and archaeological history. The image actually shows a rub on the shoulder, a pretty significant wound, as if this individual was carrying something across his shoulder or shoulders, but putting a lot of the weight on one side, on his right shoulder, so much so that the skin had rubbed off and had left a fairly significant wound in this area, a rub wound that can actually be seen in the image itself when we study it with high definition photography. The blood stains, there are blood stains, actual blood stains in this image. So I want to, make sure it's clear. There's two things on this cloth. There's an image and there are blood stains. Okay, they are two different things. The blood stains are not part of the image, they are separate. So the blood stains actually match the wounds that we see in the image, which match Christ's wounds. It is indeed human blood type AB, which is very rare in most of the world, but very common for someone of Palestinian descent. It's male, okay, so it's degraded enough that we can't get detailed DNA results, but we do know it is a male. We also know that there was high amounts of bilirubin in it, which is a pigment that our bodies emit when we are undergoing significant trauma. So whoever bled on this cloth was undergoing significant trauma, which if it's the person whose image it is, you can kind of understand why that would be. But I do want to make it clear. There's two things on this cloth. There's an image, and then there is the blood stains, which they lie on top of each other, they match each other, but they are two separate things, and that's important to note. The bloodstains match something called the Sudarium of Oviedo. You see it on the background here in my slide. But the Sudarium of Oviedo has a provenance, which means it is a clear record and chain of custody going back to the 6th century. And it is believed to be the face cloth of Jesus. If you recall from the Gospel of John, when Peter and John enter the tomb, they see the burial cloth, but the face cloth rolled up separately and placed in another location. And this is believed to be the face cloth of Jesus. And the image, the markings on the face, the blood markings and bruises on the face on the shroud have 124 points of correspondence with the face cloth of the Sudarium of Oviedo. So it's very likely these two cloths were in direct contact with the same human body at the same time. And since we have such great provenance with the Sudarium, we know that this happened sometime during or before the 6th century at the latest. Okay, so we're getting closer and closer to Christ. The shroud contains pollen in proportions that you would have expected if the shroud followed the path that I'm about to describe, its historical path from Jerusalem to Edessa to Constantinople to locations in France and then Italy. We have discovered in the 20th century that pollen is very specific to its geographic location and a very tight window. So you can actually study a fiber or a piece of cloth or anything that it can hold pollen, and based on that pollen's identity and concentration, you can know where this item was, how long approximately it stayed there based on the concentration, and in what order it went from place to place. So our pollen screening of this cloth does tell us that this cloth was in multiple locations, and locations you'll soon find out we totally expected it to be. The dirt that is detected on the cloth. So this body had dirt on it, and when the cloth was wrapped around it, the dirt came from off the body onto the cloth. And you find it at a couple of points like the nose, the heel, and the knee, places that you would expect the dirt to be, for example, if the person had taken a fall, okay? This is very specific dirt. It's a rare limestone that is only found in and around Jerusalem. The image, as I said before, is separate from the blood. It's also a photographic negative, which linen is not a photosensitive material. So how a photographic negative image appears on a linen cloth is a pretty significant mystery. And the crazy thing is, it wasn't put on at the same time or before the blood. The blood got on the cloth, presumably by having the cloth be wrapped around a bloody body. And then the blood dried and congealed, and then at some point later, the image was transferred to the cloth. Okay, so that's important. Two separate things that appear at two separate times that match. Okay, now you may be saying, why is all this blood on the cloth? You just remember a little bit about the gospel story here. Jesus was taken down from the cross very quickly on Friday evenings before the Sabbath began, so they did not have time to clean him and anoint his body as they normally would. They needed to get him off that cross and in a tomb before sundown, before the Sabbath. And that was their goal. And as you recall, the reason that Mary Magdalene and the other Marys were traveling to the tomb on that Sunday was the Sabbath was now over. So this is very early Sunday morning. And what they were doing was going to clean the body and anoint it appropriately. A couple more things, and then we'll start really moving. This is one of my favorites. So with the introduction of high definition photography in the late 20th century, we've gotten some tremendous images of this cloth. And what we found is it used to be believed that the eyes were sunken and missing in the image, which makes sense. Body decays, so maybe this image wasn't created too well after the body decayed, or if this was a piece of art, that's how the person wanted to demonstrate it. But what we now realize is that's not the case at all. It's that the eyes are covered by two coins, and these are very rare coins that were minted only one year, the year 29, by Pontius Pilate, which is just, more interesting. The front and back images are perfectly congruent. So there's two images on this cloth. So what happened is that, they'd lay the cloth down, they put the body on it, and then they would take the excess of the cloth and wrap it over the top. So it went around the body like this, and then they would tie it horizontally. So the front and back images are congruent, which means they match, and it's clearly a three-dimensional body, was at one point wrapped in this cloth. And what we know about the images was not formed by any method that we are aware of today for image creation. So this has been studied. There are many that will say this is likely the most studied ancient artifact in the world. If it is indeed an ancient artifact and not a 14th century forgery. And I'm not sure how you would go about to prove that, but it seems to be a pretty well, conceded point that this is one of the most studied artifacts on the planet. And pretty much any test that it could be subjected to, it has been subjected to, and it certainly has drawn the interest from scientists from a variety of fields for really since science has become the popular in the domain of keen interest for the last 100 years or so. But last 50, some extensive tests have been done. So we still don't understand it. We still don't understand how this image got on this cloth. Right? So that is mind-blowing, okay? No doubt about it, but you're still left with the question that all skeptics are going to have. Yeah, that's awesome, but how did it get to Leary, France in 1355? How did this family, out of nowhere, pull out the burial cloth of Jesus? Wouldn't they have always been showing it? Wouldn't it have been venerated for centuries before this? Wouldn't this have been an object that would have been treated with incredible care? And you'd have to answer yes, 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 yes to all of those. Yet here it shows up in Leary, France, apparently out of the clear blue. Well, let's figure out if that's true. So let's take a journey. And we're going to start in Jerusalem with the death and resurrection of Jesus and the early period of time in Christianity when Christianity was not legal. So it wasn't legal in the Roman Empire until the Edict of Milan in the year 313. And it wasn't the official religion of the Roman Empire until the 380, I believe, could have been 379, when Emperor Theodosius made it the official religion of the empire. In those early centuries, especially in the first century, Christians, were pretty highly persecuted and looked down upon by both, the Jewish religious authorities that Christians came out of. Christians, or all the original Christians, were indeed Jewish. They are our religious ancestors. and the Roman Empire just did not like people not conforming to the norm. So some of that persecution was pretty severe. So being Christian could be a life and death decision. Hence, artifacts, important documents, anything that was symbolically important to the faith was kept hidden or in secret or spirited away to places where it would be safe. One such place that was safe in early Christianity would have been the great city of Edessa, which is known as Sanliurfa today. It's in eastern Turkey. This was a Christian city, and you have to remember all of the Middle East was Christian, as was Africa, or at least Northern Africa, and the Near East. It wasn't until the Islamic conquest in the 7th and 8th century that Christianity was not the dominant force in this part of the world. Um, and there was a city, Edessa, which was a Christian city very early on. It was on the outskirts of the Roman Empire, so you could practice the faith there pretty safely, even under the years of persecution. So, and it had a lot of tradition and associations with Jesus and Christianity. There's actually a very old tradition of there being letters written between King Akbar, the Akbar kings actually ruled in Edessa for about 5 centuries, but the original King Akbar writing to Jesus asking him to come to bring his healing powers because Akbar was very sick. And there's a tradition that Jesus wrote back saying, I can't come now, but you will be healed, and Akbar was. But at some point, I will send my representative to you with a gift. And look for that. And, this legend of these letters, and I say legend only because we have no independent sources other than the tradition that came from Edessa itself. We do not have the original letters. There are copies that were seen and held and verified in the later centuries, the 4th and 5th and 6th century, but we don't have anything definitive that said these letters actually existed, and we have no record of Jesus writing anything to anyone in any other documentation. So it's always been something that's been disputed, and I mention it because it's an interesting tradition, but I'm not promoting that one. But this, was a reason why Edessa was such a highly Christian city, and it would be normal for other artifacts and important things to be sent there for protection. And we believe that that's what happened with the shroud. We believe that the other Judas, not Judas Iscariot the traitor, but Jude Thaddeus, the writer of the New Testament letter, actually traveled to Edessa with a gift for King Akbar, sort of fulfilling the promise that Jesus would have made in the letter. And you see him presenting this gift in the image, and the gift is an image of Jesus himself, which appears on a head, but you can see that it appears to be somehow associated with a very long cloth. And we believe what was actually given to the king was the Shroud of Turin, which would have been folded up so that the head would have been exposed, but not the whole body. And it was a gift to the king for safekeeping. Okay, so a tremendous gift to say the least. But we believe this is how the shroud got to Edessa. And it stayed in Edessa and eventually became the object that outshone even the letters. So the tradition of the letters predates the arrival of the shroud. But once the shroud got there, or this image, the image of Edessa, which is what it was called for a long time, got there, that became, the claim to fame for Edessa. And strangely enough, Edessa, for the first 5-6 centuries, never was conquered. It was one of those rare cities that seem to always be spared from all terrible things. So it was a home of potentially a couple of hugely important relics and spared from defeat from the outside for centuries. What actually defeated it was a huge flood. It was built at the bottom of a flood basin, and there was a large Mediterranean flood, or Eastern, I guess we should say Asian flood at this point. And Edessa was submerged almost entirely. So the city was destroyed as a result of that, had to be rebuilt, took years after the waters receded. But as they were rebuilding it, because they did rebuild it, when they were rebuilding the gates, the gates had withstood the flood, but needed repair. they broke through the top of the gate accidentally and found a hidden room over the top of the gate. And in that room was a jar, a sealed jar. And in the sealed jar, sure enough, was this image of Edessa, okay, rolled up in this sealed jar. So that made Edessa even more famous. The image lived through the flood, and the image became popular all over Christendom at that point. And as a matter of fact, so popular that the iconography, how we represented Jesus in images, changed drastically at that point to match the image of Edessa. As a matter of fact, there's 15 very distinct image markings on that image that all of a sudden, starting in the mid-6th century, showed up everywhere in the world in all new artwork depicting the face of Jesus. Unfortunately, about 100 years later, as Islam rose in the mid-7th century and dominated in the 8th, Edessa, like all of the Turkish cities and other Christian cities throughout the Mideast and Northern Africa, fell to Muslim control. Again, the Muslim barrage was very successful. They were tremendous warriors, and it wasn't as if it was one unified force or multiple Muslim kings attacking different cities at different times, but their techniques were very similar and very successful. The Muslim king that took over the city of Edessa was very benevolent, however, and allowed the Christians to continue their practice and actually protected the image because the Christians were fighting over the image all the time. So the Muslim king actually was its protector to keep the Christians from destroying it themselves. So that's it in Edessa. Now it stays in Edessa for quite some time, but obviously it was very popular in Edessa. It started getting the name the tetradiplon, which is doubled in four, a way to, if you fold the shroud in a certain way, you can fold it so that the only element of the image that appears is the face, and it is the most distinctive, so it makes sense to do that. But the emperor in Constantinople, so the Byzantine Empire was the last remnants of the Roman Empire as it once stood, was still in Constantinople, the one Christian city that was holding out in the Near East. So this is modern day Istanbul. Becomes aware of the image and wants to add it to his collection. You got to remember Constantine, when he founded Constantinople, his mother Helena had spent a lot of time in Jerusalem collecting artifacts. So the crown of thorns, the true cross, all sorts of things of this nature. So there was like a little museum of Christian artifacts in Constantinople, and the emperor decided it was time to add this to it. And so he made the king of Edessa, the Muslim king of Edessa, an offer he couldn't refuse. There was a brief siege, but the Muslim king was smart enough to realize he wasn't going to be able to withstand the Byzantine army. So he made a trade, the image of Edessa for 200 Muslim prisoners and a treasure of silver right at the close of the first millennium. And it stayed in Constantinople from that point forward. As a matter of fact, we learned a great deal about it through a chronicler from the Fourth Crusade. So think about the Fourth Crusade's official historian or reporter who took notes on what was happening during the crusade. It was very normal for crusaders to stop off at Constantinople to be resupplied before they went on to the Holy Land to try to repatriate it. And so the Fourth Crusade had stopped in Constantinople, and Robert de Clary, their chronicler, wrote about the Shroud of Constantinople rising out of a box where you saw the double image of Jesus. So quite interesting. He also provided some diagrams and things that helped actually reconstruct this box. So you can see that on the right-hand side of the screen. And this box was indeed reconstructed using the folds from the Shroud of Turin as a guide. And it was an exact match, and they got it to work. So clearly, de Clary was seeing something that at the very least was an exact match to the shroud rising out of this box. And they would display it every Friday night. That was until the Crusaders, who again had stopped in Constantinople for resupplying, decided that instead of moving on to Jerusalem during the Fourth Crusade, they were just going to sack the city of Constantinople. And that is exactly what they did. And they sacked it because it was loaded with riches and art and relics and gold and silver. And if you know anything about European history at this period, we'd gone through several plagues, and it was very tough going in Europe. So they saw Constantinople and said, hey, let's just take their stuff. And they did. That did not go over well with the Pope who had authorized the crusade, Innocent III. He was extremely upset by this. I'm sure you can understand why. And what he ended up doing was saying that anyone that came back or was caught with anything from Constantinople would be immediately excommunicated. And he asked the secular rulers of all of Christendom to hunt these people down, have them imprisoned and killed if they were caught with artifacts from Constantinople. So again, that Fourth Crusade was a disaster. So what ended up happening is people who had these artifacts did not actually talk much about them for obvious reasons. And strange enough, right about this time, we see documentation that the knights, the Templar Knights, their initiation ceremony started to change and started to include the veneration of the crucified man. And it's bizarre. They talk about this image and how they would venerate this image as part of the initiation ceremony. And it was like an immediate change right around the beginning of the 13th century. So pretty interesting. And then about 100 years later, the French king needed money. So since the French king also happened to, at that period of time, pretty much control the papacy was basically being held captive by the French king. He got the papacy to suppress the Templar Knights, so suppress that order. Then the king drummed up charges of heresy against the Templars, and within a 2-week period, wiped out several thousand Templar Knights throughout the country of France. Took all of their riches that they had accumulated through their efforts, basically serving as the bank for all the pilgrims going to the Holy Land. And it was just a big money grab. But that's when Geoffrey de Charnay, the Templar master from Normandy, was burned at the stake in the year 314. Which then gets you to the next 500 years. All of a sudden, about 35, 40 years later, the Charnay family says, hey, we have the burial cloth of Jesus. So it went from the Templars somehow having this thing, which they would have taken from Constantinople during the Fourth Crusade, which we know it was there in Constantinople, so it makes sense that they would have taken it. And all of a sudden, the de Charnay family, the relatives of the Templar Grand Master who is killed at the stake 40 years early, announces, hey, we have this great relic and you should come and pilgrimage to it and donate your alms to us in our little pilgrimage money-making adventure. Obviously, when it was first brought out, the local bishop was very concerned about its authenticity and voiced those concerns loudly, mostly because he had his own relics at the cathedral, and once the burial cloth of Jesus emerged, no one visited his cathedral anymore and gave alms there. They all went to this small church in Liry, France. So he was upset that he was losing his income and fought tooth and nail to try to prove that this shroud had to be a fake. Again, this went on for quite some time, basically a century. Eventually, the French royal family purchases the shroud from Margaret de Charnay or her relatives at that point. And they then travel with the shroud for quite some time, about a half a century. They never have it out of their possession. So at that point, if you were trying to be a prince or a king in Europe, you traveled quite a bit, not because you could, but because you had to. It's very difficult to hit a moving target. So one of the ways they defended themselves was by constantly moving from castle to castle to castle. So as they did that, they brought the shroud with them. It was one of their greatest treasures, if not their greatest treasure. And they did that up until 1502, when their control of the French nation really solidified and they were no longer under threat of attack. They built a permanent home at Chambéry Castle for it in the royal chapel there. And it resided there for another 3/4 of a century. In the midst of that period, the chapel did catch fire. There was quite a bit of damage done to the shroud, which was stored at night in a silver reliquary, and that reliquary melted. So there's fire damage to the shroud that was inside and water damage in an attempt to put out the fire. So pretty significant damage. 2 years later, the Poor Clare nuns, who actually helped maintain the shroud, did do some fairly significant repairs of the holes from the burns, and they replaced much of the edging, which had worn over time from constant holding up and display. And they also then decided this would be a good time to put a thick backing on the shroud to actually make it more stiff and resilient, and allow the backing to take the pressure off the shroud itself, which it did in fact do. Excuse me for that sound. So that brings us up until the next big move. In 1578, the shroud was temporarily moved to Turin, Italy, on the pretext of making it easier for Cardinal Charles Borromeo, one of the heroes of the Counter-Reformation, making it easier for him to view the shroud so he didn't have to come over the Alps to see it. But really what was happening there was the Savoys were slowly moving all of their wealth out of France into Italy because they saw the writing on the wall that their time as France's most powerful family was coming to an end. So they siphoned their riches from France over to Italy, including the shroud. And after its 1578 temporary move, it never moved back. It's been there ever since. There's actually only been one period it hasn't been in Turin, and that was during World War II when it was moved to the southern portion of the country when Turin was under attack, just to safeguard it. But again, during this period of time, multiple people, anyone came to see it. Popes, bishops, kings, the elite of the elite. As a matter of fact, the image on the screen, you see a big gathering outside St. Christopher's or St. John the Baptist's cathedral in Turin. And this is something they would do periodically. So it was always displayed inside, but sometimes they'd have huge crowds outside and they'd bring it and display it, and hold it up. And you can imagine it's out in the atmosphere. It's smoke from fires and, weather and pollution and all that kind of good stuff. But it was regularly viewed for that next 400 years. And then, two accidents changed the course of shroud history. The first one happened at the end of that period, 1898. Seconda Pia, who was an amateur photographer, was asked to take pictures of the shroud by the Savoy family. They asked that because they started to realize that the image seemed to, have faded over time, and they wanted to preserve what was left of it. And this new technology gave them that ability. But Secunda made a huge mistake when he was processing the photographic plates. He overprocessed them and produced negative images. Strangely enough, that was a great accident because, as it turns out, the shroud image itself is a negative image. And until a negative image was produced, all the detail the shroud contained could not be seen. But with this negative image, it could be seen. And this changed everything. Scientists from around the world wanted these images. They wanted to study the shroud now. They wanted to understand what created this image. As a matter of fact, the French Academy of Science, its president declared after his study of the image, the shroud is authentic. Not a good thing for him to do in secular France, post-Enlightenment France, where religion was looked at with a very skeptic eye. In fact, it probably cost him his job as the president of the French Academy of Science. But scientists would look at this, and pathologists would look at this, and with the detail they had in the image now, they couldn't come to any other conclusion other than this is an authentic image of a man who went through the things that we get described to us in Jesus's passion in the gospel, and the anatomy, the everything about how it's portrayed in the image is exactly what you would see. And even modern day forensic pathologists say the same thing. There's no other conclusion to draw. But this is the image of a man that went through this brutal treatment, this brutal torture and death. So again, pretty interesting. And again, now the shroud is not just venerated by Christians, but is very much an attractive item for scientists around the world. And it has some strange things. So, the fire in the chapel in 1532 was always suspicious. In 1972, there was another fire set in the chapel at St. John the Baptist in Turin deliberately to try to destroy the shroud. That made the news. That ended up getting a couple of scientists, NASA scientists who worked in Colorado Springs at the Air Force Academy there, to play around with some of Pia's pictures. They playfully fed them into the VPN analyzer, which is a device that could take a photograph that was made of a 3D object and produce a 3D topology out of that. And this was originally used for the moon landing picture, so they get 3D topology depictions of the moon. But they fed this into the analyzer thinking it was a two-dimensional painting or image that was produced by human hands of some kind. And strangely enough, what came out was a 3D image of Christ's face. And this startled them and startled the whole world, because now we knew that not only was it a photo negative image, but somehow it miraculously had 3D information encoded into it that we don't have the technology to do that ourselves today. So this is something that set off a firestorm in science. No pun intended. Apparently, if you see my note here, there's a couple other attempts at burning the shroud. That seems to be the preferred method of destroying it, but they failed, thank God. But now all of a sudden you had scientists all over the world saying this thing needs to be studied with modern technology. And there was a big call for this, and that's where we're going to end with part one, okay, with this call for study. And when we get together again, we will actually pick up from that point and see what the results of that study were. So I look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care.